Hello everyone. Welcome to 4 chapters for this week. We're starting off here with chapter 11 of the Hatchet. And you can think back to what happened there at the end of chapter 10 and Brian being able to start a fire for the first time. Chapter 11. There were these things to do. He transferred all of the eggs from the small beach to the shelter, reburying them near his sleeping area. It took all his will to keep from eating another one as he moved them, but he got it done, and when they were out of sight again, it was easier. He added wood to the fire and cleaned up the camping area. A good laugh, that, clean the camp. All he did was shake out the windbreaker and hang it in the sun to dry the berry juice that had soaked in. But it was a mental thing, something in his head. He had gotten depressed thinking about how they hadn't found him yet, and when he was busy, he had something to do, so the depression seemed to leave. There were things to do. With the camp squared away, he brought in more wood. He had decided to always have enough on hand for 3 days, and after spending one night with the fire for a friend he knew what a staggering amount of wood it would take, he worked all through the morning at the wood, breaking down dead limbs or breaking and chopping them in smaller pieces, storing them neatly beneath the overhang. He stopped once to take a drink at the lake, and in his reflection he saw that the swelling on his head was nearly gone. There was no pain there, so he assumed that had taken care of itself. His leg was also back to normal, although he had a small pattern of holes, roughly star-shaped, where the quills had nailed him. And while he was standing at the lake shore taking stock, he noticed that his body was changing. He had never been fat, but he had been slightly heavy, with extra weight above his belt at the sides. This was now completely gone, and his stomach had caved in with the hunger, and the sun had cooked him past burned, so he was tanned, with smoke from the fire and his face starting to look like leather. But perhaps more than his body was the change in his mind, or in the way he was becoming. I'm not the same, he thought. I see, I hear differently. I did not know when the change started, but there it was. When a sound came to him now, he didn't just hear it, but he would know the sound. He would swing and look, a breaking tree, a movement of air, and know the sound as if it could somehow move his mind back down the wave of sound to the source. He could know what the sound was before he quite realized he'd even heard it. His senses were all extremely sensitive. And when he saw something with his eyes, a bird moving, a wing inside a bush, or a rip on the water, he would truly see that thing. Not just notice it as he used to notice in the city. He would see every single minute part of it. He would see the whole wing, the whole feathers, all of the color of the feathers, see the bush, the size, the shape, the color of the leaves. He would see the way the light moved with the ripples on the water and see that the wind made the ripples and which way the wind had to blow to make the ripples. None of that used to be in Brian's mind, and now it was a part of him, a changed part of him, a grown part of him, and the two things, his mind and his body, had come together as well. They made a connection with each other that he didn't quite understand. When his ears heard a sound or his eyes saw a sight, his mind took control of his body. Without his thinking, he moved his face to the sight or the sound, moved and was ready to deal with it. There were these things to do. When the wood was done, he decided to get a signal fire ready. He moved to the top of the rock ridge that comprised the bluff over his shelter and was pleased to find a large flat stone area. More wood, he thought, moaning. He went back to the fallen trees and found more dead limbs, carrying them up on the rock until he had enough time for a bonfire. Initially, he had thought of making a signal fire every day, but he couldn't. He would never be able to keep the wood supply going. So while he was working, he decided to have the fire ready, and if he heard an engine or even thought he heard a plane, he would run up with the burning limb and set a signal fire. Things to do. At the last trip to the top of the stone bluff with wood, he stopped and sat on a point overlooking the lake and rested. The lake lay before him, 20 or so feet below, and he had not seen it this way since he had come in with the plane. Remembering the crash, he had a moment of fear. A breath-tightening little rip of terror. But it passed, and he was quickly caught up with the beauty of the scenery. It was so incredibly beautiful that it was almost unreal. From his height, he could see not just the lake, but across part of the forest, a green carpet, and it was full of life. Birds, insects, was a constant hum and song. At the other end of the bottom of the L, there was a large rock sticking out of the water, and on top of the rock, a snaggly pine had somehow found food and grown bent and gnarled. Sitting on one limb was a bluebird with a crest and a sharp beak, a kingfisher, he thought of a picture he had once seen, which left the branch while he watched and dove into the water. It emerged a split part of a second later. In its mouth was a small wiggling silver fish in the sun. It took the fish to a limb, juggled it twice, and swallowed it whole. Fish! Of course, he thought. There were fish in the lake, and they were food, and if a bird could do it. He scrambled down the side of the bluff and trotted to the edge of the lake, looking down into the water. Somehow it had never occurred to him to look inside the water, only at the surface. The sun was flashing back up into his eyes, and he moved off to the side and took his shoes off and waded out 15 feet into the water. Then he turned and stood still with the sun at his back and studied the water again. He saw a moment literally packed with life. Small fish swam everywhere, some narrow, some long, some round. Most of them were 3 or 4 inches long, some a bit longer, and many smaller. There was a patch of mud off to the side leading into deeper water, and he could see old clam shells there, so there must be clams. As he watched, a crayfish, looking at a tiny lobster, left one of the empty clam shells and went to dig looking for another. When he stood, some of the small round fish came quite close to his legs, and he tensed, got ready, and made a wild stab, grabbing one of them. They exploded away in hundreds of flicks, quick-like, so fast that he had no hope of catching them that way. But soon they came back. They seemed to be curious about him, and as he walked from the water, he tried to think of a way to use his curiosity to catch them. He had no hooks or string, but if he could somehow lure them into the shallows and make a spear, a small fishing spear, he might be able to strike fast enough to get one. He would have to find the right kind of wood, slim and straight. He had seen some willows up along the lake that might work, and he could use the hatchet to sharpen it and shape it while he was sitting by the fire tonight. And that brought up the fire, which he had to go feed again. He looked at the sun and saw it was getting late in the afternoon, and when he thought of how late it was, he thought that he ought to reward all of his work with another egg, and that made him think of some dessert would be nice. He smiled when he thought of dessert. So fancy! And he wondered if he should move up the lake and see if he could find some raspberries. After he banked the fire, and while he was looking for the right wood for a spear. Spearwood, he thought. And it all rolled together. It just rolled together and rolled over him. These were all things he needed to do. And that was chapter 11. Thank you for listening.